Yo.
Oh, hello.
Do you wanna so I can introduce her, and then do you want to just announce the book Ignorance and then the sale code, and then that you'll be
okay, yeah, I could do. I also just sent an email in advance of the meeting just 5 minutes ago, and I sent that whole code with the paragraph that she sent, so that went out to the whole. It just went to the whole listserv.
Cool. Wait, why do I not have it?
You don't. Let's saw it just like
Yeah. For some reason my thing was okay. Well, then maybe we can just remind people briefly.
Yeah, to tell them to email them.
Do you want me to introduce her?
Yeah, if you can, that would be good. And they'll just hear whatever the format is and guide through whatever the discussion, and then I guess
so Renata's going to talk, and then Marcus and I are going to speak a little bit. There's
hello.
Renata. Hi.
Oh, hi. Hey, Marcus.
And then Patricia's going to start off the discussion, and then you can moderate it.
Hello. Hi.
Okay.
Hi, Renata.
The discussion's going to be with all you guys. All three of you will, or four will be in discussion then at that point.
Well, Marcus and I are just going to make some remarks, and then I think Patricia has some questions to start a back and forth with Renata. I mean, she can respond to us and then to Patricia, and then Evan, maybe you want to kick off the larger discussion with the group.
Okay.
Yeah,
I guess I'll ask. I can ask them again to do the hand raise function, like you did yesterday, and we did with Afro-pessimism, and I'll call on people through that.
Renata, how are you?
Very well. In a lockdown, like everyone. How are you?
We're not in lockdown yet, but they are closing indoor dining on Monday. Sadly.
Yeah, we are in a total lockdown for 2 months already. So, yeah, like you know. So, Evan, I wanted to ask you if you can put that code for the discount.
Evan sent it to the whole listener, but Evan, not everyone who's coming will be on DU because they got the message.
Oh, okay, I'll put it in the chat at some point. I'll put it in the chat.
So I missed the start. What was your idea, the timings?
So you speak for however long you want.
Probably about 20 minutes, I would say.
That's great. And then Marcus and I just have some remarks about ignorance in psychoanalysis, and we have some clinical examples. And then Patricia's gonna also speak, and then she's gonna start the discussion with you. So maybe just a first discussion amongst us.
Yes.
And then Evan will then lead it into the wider, will moderate in the wider community.
Excellent. And we go like an hour and a half or something.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Are you doing all your book promotion on Zoom?
Yeah, everything is on Zoom. You do all your psychoanalysis on Zoom?
I went back to the office, so
everything on Zoom.
But I mean, everything else is on Zoom. I mean, 80% of the patients are on Zoom. I just see a few of them.
I remember, Evan, you wrote about Zoom psychoanalysis in the first wave.
Oh, yeah.
It was good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that seems so long ago.
I know, another year.
Well, here's Patricia.
So do I need extra light? Like this is okay? Or...
No, it's good. Hello.
Marcus, you have long hair.
Yes, I refuse to go to the hairdresser.
So you don't have a COVID hidden hairdresser somewhere?
No.
because that's with us, because we are in lockdown for 2 months, you know, the question is who has good hairstyle, you know, that politicians who are transgressing.
I just got my hair dyed and cut.
Ah.
But they're rolling out the vaccine, Renata, in London, no?
Yeah, but I'm not in London at the moment, in Ljubljana.
You are?
We are a little bit, you know, behind. But you know, I don't know, like so many people don't want to have vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a real problem.
Because they're anti-vaxxers?
And afraid, but like I was just speaking with friends in Paris. They say that even more people in Paris like are, you know, like refusing.
Huh.
Or, you know, even their scientists are saying, you know, it's not clear. I'm waiting to be vaccinated the first minute when it's available.
That's so funny. So they want everyone to die? They want to die? What do they want?
I don't know. I think more proof, whatever, that they won't die.
Hello.
Are you still working, Jameson, in the hospital?
No. It was really just the first wave when it was
Okay.
so chaotic. It's not bad here in New York. I mean, that's the thing, in the city.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll probably get bad, I guess, but I feel like we're being spared.
At the moment, we had a good summer, but now it's coming. Ooh. Hello, Patricia.
Hello, Renata. Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Hi.
Can you see? I just posted in the chat the
Yes,
the code. You
thank
can see.
you.
Okay, so we'll just leave that there and let
Thank
people
you.
know it's
Thank
there.
you. Excellent. Thank you.
Oh, Jean-Michel is joining us. That's
Yeah.
in the other room.
In the other room. That's the end of the universe. After that is the precipice, the elephants holding everything, a turtle.
Renata, you didn't write about flat earthers.
Yes.
No, not yet. They are more American phenomenon, I think.
Is that true? Is that true?
Yeah.
I had 2 taxi drivers in Berlin over the last 2 years who were flat earthers. Seems to be a thing among taxi drivers. Maybe it's, you know.
But if you drive too long a taxi, you think
the earth is flat.
You're flattened in the air.
How do you even get into that conversation? Is it just like the people like that, just like they can't stop themselves, they have to proclaim that belief? Yeah.
Yesterday here in Philadelphia, there is a square very close, and there was a market, and there was a group of fundamentalists, like 4 or 5 with big megaphones, with a big sign, "Women belong in the kitchen, fags and whores will go to hell." So all the rest are spare, or I don't know. And they were accusing everybody of being sinners, and they were going with megaphones around the city saying, "Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming." So an entertaining afternoon.
That sounds like that group that always would show up like after the massacre in Sandy Hook. They would show up with the same sign saying "You're going to hell." But they had a pretty low profile, because I think the father and the son ended up having a big conflict, and I actually haven't heard about them, but what you're saying sounds like their trademark, like really offensive kind of things.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that they are protected by hate speech. It's free.
Right.
The freedom of speech includes hate speech, because they're really their response is to go to a neighborhood where everybody will be upset and there were people engaged in them. Now the best response is then a group of musicians came with huge trumpets, and they muffled the sound with like jazz music. So that was great. Did I miss anything about the logistics? How we're going
Oh,
to
That's
go?
right, you weren't here. No, so Renata's gonna speak 20 minutes or so,
Yeah.
whatever she wants. And then Marcus and I will make some remarks on ignorance and psychoanalysis and what we're gonna call object petite I.
Object
Uh,
cause of ignorance.
What is it?
The object cause of ignorance.
Yeah, the object
That's
cause of ignorance. And then Patricia, you had a clinical example and a question
Yes.
that could
Yes.
start a conversation between the four of us.
Mhm.
And then Evan will transition us to the larger group discussion.
So who's
Yeah.
going to go first between Jameson and Marcus? Are you going to both have yourselves on screen, or just one at a time? Whoever speaks will appear, and then the other one will appear after.
I don't know. You want to go first, Jameson, and then
I went first yesterday.
oh, you went first. Yeah, okay, then I go first.
That worked out so nicely. So
I'm gonna do that again and again on the Zoom.
Yeah, that's Zoom. That's Zoom. Again and again and again and again.
Hey, look, we have 67 people. How nice is that, Renata?
Ah.
Good.
right? Wow, that's great.
People are not ignoring us.
Yeah, that's very good.
Where do you see them? Oh, I'm not a host, so I can't see them. I want to see.
68, yeah, they're on the right. Well, should we let them in?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone's ready? Okay. It's like Hollywood Squares.
Hi.
Hello all.
Hello, everybody. Hold on, I still have to keep letting people in, like little by little. Someone was listening to Into My Arms.
Oh, that's me. Sorry.
Oh, nice. It's nice.
Sorry. Yes, hi.
Hi.
Hi. Does the presenter mind if I'm super rude and cut out the video just because I'm cooking and moving around? Is that really rude?
No, that's fine, as long as you mute yourself.
Yes, of course.
All right. Well, I will keep looking at making sure I can admit everybody. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. We're really happy to have Renata here to present her new book, A Passion for Ignorance, which in the chat box, you can see that you can get a 30% discount. There's a code there for everybody, should you want to purchase the book. Renata's a long time.
Could you resend that maybe a little while in? I don't think I came in after you sent it. Sorry to interrupt.
It should be in the chat box right now. If you look in, click where the chat is. And I also sent to Unbehagen about 20 minutes ago an email that includes that code. Can you see it?
Yeah, it doesn't have anything like before I joined the meeting. And there may be stragglers, so I was just saying in 10 minutes maybe or so send it out in the chat. But I don't mean to derail things. I just am interested.
Okay, I'll send it again before we leave. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
For those of you who don't know, this event is under the auspices of Das Unbehagen. We're the ragtag bunch of psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic friendly people, mainly centered in New York, but we have quite an international group at this point. And we're very happy to have Renata with us. It's not the first time. She's spoken with our group before. Because she's always writing on prescient topics, whether it's anxiety or the anxiety of choice or the perversions of love and hate. her collection that she did on sexuation, which was one of the first things I read. It was an incredibly important book to me in my education. And Renata was actually my teacher when I was 21 years old. I took her course at Cardozo, and I was totally terrified. And I wanted to write a paper on Pokemon. And I remember trying to explain this to her. I don't know what I was thinking. Anyways, well, that was a long time ago. So I'm just going to give her an introduction. I'm going to, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we're going to go through the next period of time. Renata is a Slovenian philosopher, sociologist, and legal theorist. She's senior researcher at the Institute of Criminology and Faculty of Law at the University of Ljubljana, and holds a professorship at Birkbeck College at the University of London. As well, she's been teaching at Cardozo, which is where I studied with her. How she flies back and forth to all these places has always mystified me. Just to give you a sense of her important works, in 1994, she wrote The Spoils of Freedom, Psychoanalysis and Feminism After the Fall of Socialism. In 1996, with Slavoj Žižek, Gaze and Voice as Love Objects. In 98, The Perversions of Love and Hate. In 2000, Sexuation, which is a collection that I was just speaking about. In 2004 on Anxiety, 2010 on Choice, and now in 2020 we have her book, A Passion for Ignorance. Renata's going to talk for 20 minutes. Marcus, Patricia, and myself are going to respond, engage in a conversation with her, and then we hope to open up to the wider Zoom audience. And obviously for those of us, especially those of us here in the US, the question of ignorance, I think, is something that is weighing very, very heavily on our minds. We really, really need a way to think about this, Renata. So help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jameson, and thank you, my dear friends in New York and elsewhere, for joining me. Actually, in the meantime, I wrote a short book only in Slovenian language, Homo homini virus, which is sort of like continuing from the ignorance in the book, The Passion for Ignorance, which I literally sent off at the end of March. I have put, a little bit on, the ignorance that we are living through now in the time of the pandemic. But in some way, the book has been sort of like opening many questions, which are still, very much pertinent today. The question of knowledge, the question of authority, the question of subjectivity, and in some way, like let's say, I remember like a few weeks ago in Slovenia, people were debating, whom to believe now that we are living with this virus for some time. And at the moment in Slovenia, we are in a 2-month-long lockdown, quite a serious lockdown. Only industries are in a way working, but all shops or restaurants, everything is closed and you cannot move out of your municipality. So there was this debate recently. One person said, I don't believe that the virus exists. And, people have been dying, like you have experienced this in the first wave, we are experiencing this in the second wave. So one person said, I don't believe that the virus exists because I cannot see this virus with my eyes. And the other person said, yes, I agree with you. All the images we are shown on the television are just works of art. There is no virus, it's all conspiracy. So this question of, knowledge, scientific knowledge, which is presented to us, and, the belief or disbelief that we are witnessing is sort of opening all kinds of questions about ignorance, which I'm addressing in a more kind of a theoretical way in the book, where I'm questioning sort of like how philosophy in the past and today has dealt with the limits of knowledge and sort of the importance of, in a way, going back to the medieval philosopher Nicholas de Cusa, who was sort of discussing that in a way learned ignorance is sort of like a way to go, in a way admitting the limits of your knowledge. And in today's pandemics, that's like what most of the wise scientists and politicians are saying. There is so much unknown, and it is better to admit sort of the lacks of our knowledge when we are addressing the public. So that in a way, overconfidence in the knowledge is what might be anxiety provoking in today's times. Just like recently, the lead epidemiologist in Slovenia said, I'm the most afraid of people who claim that they know everything about COVID-19. So there is even like an anxiety related to this overconfidence that we can observe. However, what I'm tackling in this book are in a way two questions related to ignorance. First is the subjective dimension, where psychoanalysis has been of great help. Since most of you who are working in the domain of psychoanalysis know that Freud and post-Freudians have been talking about ignorance, denial, negation, which are of course not the same thing, but in some way they all are kind of leading us to this question of the unknown, or better, the points in our lives where actually we are coming too close to something painful, where in a way closing our eyes, denying, negating, or ignoring might be coping strategies. So in the book, I'm discussing how ignorance, should not be taken simply with a kind of a negative connotation. Quite often in the public discourse, we accuse other people of, being ignorant, and rarely would admit our own ignorance. But, in some way, psychoanalysis has pointed us that it is important for the psychoanalyst, him or herself, in a way to kind of be a certain kind of, we can even say, an enlightened idiot, someone who is taken from the position of the analysant as subject supposed to know, but who has to sort of like refuse the position of authority, of a master, of someone who is telling the analysant, what might be truth of his or her desire, or what might be behind his or her trauma. Now, Jacques Lacan coined this term passion for ignorance after he was attending lectures in Buddhism at the Sorbonne, and he reinterpreted in his own way, the ideas of ignorance, which are, I think, most pertinent in kind of the theories of Zen Buddhism, where we are discussing sort of like ignorance in the way that might be closer to the kind of the Lacanian reinterpretation. Now, why Lacan took this term was because he observed early on in his career that people came to him with the desire to know what might be behind their suffering, but then they did everything in a way not to come close to the core of their traumas, desires, fantasies, drives. So that's like in a simple way, an explanation of why Lacan, in a way, borrowed this term. Now, I'm trying to address current problems of subjectivity with this theoretical framework, which was developed in Freudian, post-Freudian, Lacanian, but also sort of other theories. So I'm using quite a broad range of theories which have been addressing ignorance, from philosophical theories to also sociological theories, which are speaking about the sort of social context where ignorance might be strategic, elevated, by the position, by the power positions, or economic forces. Or I'm even using some anthropological theories, where are theories how in certain societies secrecy might be a way for the society to hold itself together. But at the core, as I said, is sort of like Lacanian idea of the kind of a deadlock that, pertains to knowledge in, the Lacanian interpretation of ignorance. But I wanted to go further from these, old discussions, which is why in the book, I opened up questions about subjectivity today. So today we have all kinds of new types of knowledge, like genetics, neuroscience, algorithms, and they're in a way reinterpreting the idea of subjectivity. Quite often, we are under the impression that we can come to the core of ourselves with the help of a genetic test or a brain scan, or that algorithms, can in a way know more about our desires than we do. And I'm questioning in today's times, how ignorance plays, what a role for the subject, what is the role of ignorance today? So especially with genetics, my idea is that quite often we interpret genes as some kind of through a certain kind of a fantasy lens. Often genes appear, a kind of a Lacanian real, something that is in us more than ourselves, ungraspable, something that stands at the place of the lack. And, there is not much there has not been much done in the domain of psychoanalysis to actually analyze this kind of fantasies. There were few texts that I came across which analyzed how people form these fantasies, and they were interesting because they pointed out that people who were trying to find the truth, like what they inherited from their parents or which illnesses might await them in the future, would often find all kinds of strategies to deny or negate, close their eyes when this truth was unbearable, or even when they find negative answer to their anxiety provoking question, let's say whether I am a bearer of a genetic predisposition for a particular kind of a cancer, they would search for another truth. As soon as they get a negative answer to one test, they would search maybe for another test, which means that anxiety would not be alleviated when they are presented with a particular kind of knowledge. I also question how contemporary medicine is dealing with this passion for ignorance, since we are living in times of informed consent, where a person is supposed to rationally understand the procedures, sign the document of consent and so on. And, of course, again, I find an incredible need for, denial, ignorance, negation, and so on. And when I looked with this apparatus, current pandemic, I observed very similar phenomena at work. So in the 80s, there was in the domain of medicine an interesting psychological study done by professor I think his name is Breznitz in Israel, and he was looking at patients who were facing life-threatening disease, primarily coronary patients, and he observed all kinds of strategies. He even calls it 7 types of denials. And when I used now analyzing denials that we observe at the time of COVID, I observed that we have almost similar type of denials at work. Some people would find all kinds of strategies to deny information. They would just close their eyes in front of the information. It's like the people I was explaining at the beginning who claim, if I cannot see the virus, it doesn't exist. Others would, sort of like push away emotional impact. They would appear that, COVID is nothing that affects them. Or, some would have already symptoms of infection, but would again deny these symptoms. Still others today are experience, what, Brezhnich called kind of the seventh type of denial, which were, kind of psychotic delusions. So we now observe psychotic delusions in regard to COVID. I was quite impressed when I was reading in German newspapers how there was one person not too long ago who was under the impression that his mobile phone got infected, his WhatsApp application got infected by a Chinese virus, computer virus, which in his mind protects him now from the coronavirus. And when I was digging a little bit further, I saw still other types of delusions, which I'm sure that my friends psychoanalysts would probably tell us more about. Now, in the book, I then kind of moved to another problem of ignorance, which is the question how people actually deal with the fact that they themselves might be ignored. So I'm trying to link two quite different things, ignorance as a certain kind of a relationship to knowledge, in a kind of a traditional definition, and the kind of a social dimension of being ignored, not acknowledged. So I'm posing a question whether this second type of ignorance, this social ignorance, in some way affects people's relationship to knowledge. And that's in a way at the very end where I'm sort of ending with some examples about this. When I was quite positively, I must say, surprised when I started reading how current analysis of conspiracy theories or the sort of the passions that are at work in sharing fake news are actually linked to this feeling of being in a way ignored. And so I came across some studies which are at the moment very few and very new, which are looking at the enjoyment, we would call it jouissance in Lacanian discourse, that pertains to sharing fake news or conspiracy theories. And for me, the most important point was that in many cases of people who are passionately sharing this information, we can observe the lack of belief, so that people who would share conspiracy theories actually do not believe in these theories themselves, or people who are sharing fake news do not believe in this news. However, they get an emotional gain, which means that first they are stirring anger on the other side, let's say the other political side, or among people who they hope to provoke. And I would add to this, they are also getting emotional gain of recognition in their own group. So they are getting a certain acknowledgement. And many of these people might very well feel that they have been ignored. So as in another chapter in the book, I analyze this problem of people feeling ignored in the incel community, who are in some way living kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, complaining that they are ignored, but then of course do everything to continue to be ignored or be ignored even more. But they are also gaining something, emotionally. There is an enjoyment, I would say, as part of their very aggressive discourse, which we should take into account. So I think that our current studies of sort of ignorance do need to look at that feeling of being ignored, or even the more sociological studies which are looking at people's status. So steering emotions online might give you a particular kind of a status that you don't have otherwise, or that you feel deprived of. And through aggressive speech you might get paradoxical kind of recognition, even recognition through a certain kind of a pain of the victim when, you know, someone responds, or at least where you get a certain kind of a feeling that another has, you know, got your message, that the letter has arrived at its destination. So to conclude, you know, my book tries to look at the current situation, also the question of big data, the ignorance related to it, the algorithms, the question of subjectivity in today's times, and, you know, the more general social question of, you know, who is the subject in today's time. We have been discussing in psychoanalysis quite a lot how the big other doesn't exist, how in some way identification with authority has changed. And I think that, you know, psychoanalytic theory sort of needs to go further in this analysis in order to fight against disinformation that exists today, and also to, in a way, fight against the aggression that exists in the online world. I think it would be very important to see how that feeling of, you know, being ignored in a way contributes to the desire to, you know, act in an aggressive way in the online world. Sometimes, you know, people who are sharing the conspiracy theories are saying that their, you know, real desire is to send everything to hell, let the world burn. Of course, they probably don't want to burn themselves. They hope to survive themselves. They might have a desire that they are left and a few others, but all the rest might be gone. So the fantasy of a new beginning might very well be, you know, part of, you know, what's happening now with the pandemic. That might be kind of a fantasy that we will witness in the near future. So how does, you know, that feeling that we are ignored contribute to, in a way, the ignorance that people are showing to knowledge, to some, you know, established, let's say, scientific knowledge? What is happening today also when we have a certain change in how, you know, knowledge is transmitted, where more and more we are the ones that are choosing, you know, whom to believe, where there is a certain nivelization between, you know, the official news, scientific information, influencers, and other people who are, you know, prominently, you know, gaining recognition in the online world. So in the future, I hope myself to kind of go further with these studies, and of course, pandemic that we are all living through will be, you know, will provide a fruitful, you know, sort of field to go further in ignorance studies of today.
Thank you, Renata. Marcus and I are going to make some remarks and then turn it over to Patricia. Marcus, do you want to begin? There's so much to say about ignorance, especially, you know, since we're a community of analysts.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Renata, and thank you also for the book, which I read with a lot of admiration and with astonishment about my ignorance as to the many ways that exists in which one can be ignorant. I mean, this is like a wonderful read of ways of denial, ways of not wanting to know, that I wasn't aware of that they existed. So I completely agree with you that there is a need for ignorance studies also in the presentation of the multifariousness of ways that ignorance takes nowadays. I wanted to bring up a couple of thoughts, or refer to a couple of thoughts that I had in the invitation that you also now repeated, and the invitation that is in the book to psychoanalysis or to psychoanalysts to move into this very tricky, difficult field in which a certain recognition for the need of ignorance has to take place, not only, certainly also as a coping mechanism, as a necessary defense or screen of the subject, but also of a somewhat more structural necessity of the recognition of ignorance built in, as it were, in what is called the subject or what is called the psyche, on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, the fight against stupidity or denial or violent types of ignoring. And to do this maybe first in a Freudian fashion, one could say that your beautiful constellation of moving, ignoring as an active, as it were, accident of the subject, together with being ignored into the same sphere, and making a knot out of these two, one moves into the Freudian grammatical logic of the drive. Ignoring, being ignored is the drive returning to the subject, of which the third instance or the third phase would be becoming ignorant or becoming ignorance even in a very, very strong sense. And I think this is something that one could think about as underlying the richness of ways of ignorance, that there is a true passion, and maybe we could speak a bit more about the word passion also, and not only about ignorance, is a true passion in the fundamental, almost transcendental sense of a being wanting to be that, wanting to be ignorant, and not just having ignorance as an accident to the subject, but as Lacan says, taking the passion for ignorance as a way of being, as an almost transcendental attitude that forms the totality of the subject and what it knows, doesn't know, etc. And in that, one would have to ask what that is. What is the passion for ignorance as passion? What moves the subject into being completely ignorance, and what is it in it? And the 3 points one could make. First, a very famous sentence by Freud, often quoted, too often quoted, I quote it again. And now one of the posthumous fragments, psyche is extended, doesn't know of it. So there is something in the psyche itself that is ignorant of itself. So there is something of the topology, as it were, of the psyche that includes its own being ignorant of itself. The second point is Freud's also very famous passage in, actually repeated passage in the interpretation of dreams, one of the most famous quotes in Freud, the mycelium and the navel of the dream, where the unknown to which the dream is connected is not just the limit of knowledge. It's not just a stop. You can analyze and then you have to stop because you can't go further. But the navel leads into a field where thinking and ignorance become identified with each other. So there again, Freud refers to something structural that makes the tissue of the psyche as knowledge and as desire and as production of knowledge and ignorance the same thing. So there seems to be an overlap in the Freudian intuition of these two dimensions, which make the moments in which he zooms into more concrete ways of being ignorant, in particular denial, even more interesting. I mean, we all know the most concrete example of denial is the denial of the absence of the penis of the mother, and either two solutions, either the creation of a fetish that stands in instead, or the splitting of the ego in his late text, which again leads to some kind of fundamental structure where ignorance is part of the psyche itself. So it's this kind of dimension of ignorance that one could immediately relate to the very general questions of death, the absence of sexual relation, and the fear of madness that is included in the very fact that one is a speaking being. And this kind of structural necessity of the ignorance is there, it makes psychoanalysis a very tricky endeavor, because one has to recognize it's kind of the structural presence of ignorance, recognize also that the passion for ignorance is an entry point into analysis. If the subject does not want to not know, transference is not going to happen. Transference is not only love, but is the passion for ignorance. It's actually sustains the analytic work. So things become, with the diagnosis that you have given, much more complicated for psychoanalysis, because no longer an easy kind of recognition of the necessity and the structural presence of ignorance, but the spot becomes even more tight between the recognition of that and of course, the undoing of all kinds of stupid and nihilistic assumptions about knowledge.
I'm just going to pick up on Marcus's point and try to push more strongly how, in reading your book, you realize how important the question of the non-knowledge within the position of the analyst is for this particular moment in time. I mean, every realm that Renata goes over, whether it's the kind of hyperbolic claims of what the discovery that DNA is going to lead to with respect to subjectivity, to the kind of crazy litigiousness that that surrounds the medical profession, that makes you sign these papers concerning informed consent, with the idea at this point that we all have to be experts on our own treatment. And I was just thinking of like every single button you click when you agree to these like massive legal documents, when you even like download an app. I mean, what you're consenting to with respect to knowledge at every single point in time, even to the questions of big data, which is obviously important with books now like Surveillance Capitalism, where the idea is that we're not in a capitalism that's the kind of exploitation that's local and felt in your body, but an exploitation that's of your data that manipulates you without your understanding. And how we all are willfully ignorant of this knowledge that's being taken from us. And we know it, and yet we participate in it. Anyway, so within all these realms, I started to think of the good old fashioned dialectic of enlightenment. The sort of critical theory, Adorno and Horkheimer, talking about this reversal from the ideals of reason and knowledge and enlightenment into pure barbarism, with which they define the 20th century, but are taking the kind of delirious form of the 21st century now. And Adorno's statement, which is a statement about a kind of anal scopic mentality of what he called the rage of the belly-turned mind, right? The idea that everything sensuous, everything in life can be turned into mind, can be turned into knowledge, can be turned into reason, can be turned into understanding, right? Which is always going to sharpen the difference between that and what we don't know, which we're then going to want to push away radically. And so the analytic position, really, insofar as it respects the limits of knowledge and tries to embody that, as Marcus is saying, that you want to take the position of making yourself ignorant, as the analytic position seems more important than ever. And so in light of this, we kind of, Marcus and I jokingly decided that we should come up with a new category in psychoanalysis, which we're going to call object petit I, which are object causes of ignorance, and that we could start a catalog. We could start an amazing catalog. So if I was just going to, like do a first pass on the catalog, you would start with Freud's 3 objects of ignorance in the 3 essays, which is the vaginal orifice, the role of semen in reproduction, and the question of intercourse. We don't know any of these things. By virtue of that, we also don't understand love. We don't understand death. We don't understand corpses. We don't even understand what dies. Is it the mind? Is it the organs? Is it the breath? We could ask this question infinitely, We don't understand speech. We don't know what it means to speak. We don't even know where the voice comes from. Where is the voice? Where is it located? Is it located in your head? Is it located in your mouth? Is it located in the air? Is it located in your ears? Is it located in your, throat or your chest? We don't understand erections. We don't understand enjoyment. We certainly don't understand bodies. We don't understand life. What is life? What constitutes life? When is life there and when is it not there? Which is a question concerning conception. We don't understand shit. We don't understand toxins. We don't understand elimination, which is a huge preoccupation today. Where are the toxins? Find the toxins. Find what's toxic, right? Let's all detox. I think very importantly, we don't understand money. Right? What the hell is money? Where is it? Where is it moving around? Where is it going? How can I see where all of it is? Who's moving it around? Who has it? Jeff Bezos clearly has a lot of it, especially now. We don't understand masturbation. And we don't, and this is a huge psychoanalytic question, we don't understand transmission. And that I think is one of the most interesting questions, which is obviously at the heart of your book, Renata, in terms of questions right now about social links, social groups that are being formed around different configurations of knowledge and ignorance. And that what they often seem to want is, through their ignorance and their kind of crazy beliefs or conspiracy theories or whatever you want, however you want to configure it, that they are looking to see transmission amongst one another, right? I'm an incel and I believe X, Y, or Z. And then someone else says, oh yeah, I believe that too. And you feel in that moment as if, there's some transmission has taken place. I mean, of course, it's organized around a field of knowledge, but I think it really is a question about transmission and learning, which is a constant question for us as analysts and as part of a group, is how do we, for example, transmit anything that we know or that we learn as analysts, insofar, especially as it takes place as a non-knowledge, right? And so this was always the kind of major question for the institutions, is how do we organize ourselves as a group of analysts who need to speak about what we don't know but do, right? In a way that ensures that this strange thing called psychoanalysis continues. And just like a few clinical comments, it's something we can certainly speak about. One, my patients feel incredibly hypervigilant. I don't know whether I would say this is more so than before, but there's a kind of hypervigilance that's certainly reinforced in the atmosphere of track everything, know everything, see everything. And the impossibility of letting this rest, of helping them find a place where they rest from this attempt to know everything, right? Which becomes this wild ignorance if you try to know everything. I mean, that was Adorno's point. And something funny about the subject supposed to know that I've felt in analytic work, which is that I sometimes feel like there's a difference between being in the position of the subject supposed to know and the subject who's supposed to mean, the subject who's supposed to be in possession of meaning. Because in the transfer from the patient to you with respect to knowledge, you can say something and then they can have a reaction to it and they can think about it themselves. But when they're in search of meaning, right, which I think is a different form of knowledge and this kind of hyper vigilant kind of control, they often try to force you to say what you mean when you just spoke. Again, it's an interesting question about transmission and speech, because transmission and speech then are reduced to somehow meaning and understanding. So I often find myself struggling in this place. And I'm going to bastardize this because I didn't have time to look it up before today's meeting, but there's this quote that I remember of Lacan where he's commenting on that very basic Freudian idea that to even wonder about the meaning of life is to be neurotic. And he's saying about the hysteric that insofar as she constantly asks the question of what is a man or a woman, and interrogates everybody around her with respect to that. What is a man? What is a woman? He says that she will never become one. To ask this question almost precludes becoming a woman. And he says the only answer to what is a woman is let yourself be. Let it be. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Patricia. Thank you, Renata.
Thank you. Thank you, Renata, for giving us a wonderful opportunity. Here we are on a Sunday, a group of psychoanalysts and psychoanalytically friendly or psychoanalytically intrigued people, talking about ignorance rather than trying to build up on knowledge. And I was thinking that you remind us in your book and today in the talk that the position of the analyst should be one of ignorance, as Lacan proposed, of learned ignorance, following from Nicholas Cusanus, and that in fact is a humbling experience in the clinical practice, that every time an analyst believes that he or she knows something about the analysand, is probably a moment of resistance on the side of the analyst, that often the most productive sessions are those in which the analyst may not know, if we are talking about knowledge, what's happening or what's supposed to happen or where the session should lead to. And this brought to mind, following this idea of perhaps taking, you use the word fantasy several times in your presentation, that we could take the idea of ignorance perhaps as a fantasy, as a frame with which we create reality, we construct it, and a frame which, as we know, has a void as its center, is a screen, and there is nothing behind it. And one thing that is we're reminded with your book is that as humans, we are easily duped, and Lacan makes a theory of it with the idea of the mirror stage. From very early on in life, we are constantly duped. And even the analysts who are supposed to be non-dupe, le non-dupe air, still make mistakes. And here I would like to maybe reconstruct, maybe think with your help, with the idea of productive ignorance. And we have been in the discussion talking a lot about knowledge. And what I had in mind is that often if we go to this object cause of ignorance, this object petit I, not be confused with the I, first I, capitalized first person singular, that in analysis, what we are pursuing is not knowledge, but truth. And they are, and in the age of fake news, often we will talk about post-truth. The attack is not so much in knowledge, even though science is discredited as able to produce knowledge, is, I think, ultimately an attack on truth, and or maybe a disappearance of truth as something interesting in pursuing. And what ignites and what makes, I think, analysis a very interesting discourse, and in my personal opinion, an interesting practice, is that it aims at the unveiling of truth. And with this in mind, I wanted maybe to share, to try to think clinically, a case of something that, reading your book, I was wondering, is it ignorance? Is it repression? Is it scotomization, which is a word used already by Freud and then taken up by Lacan? And I will give a very quick vignette of a man who, in his late 50s, he always wanted to be a writer, and he had in mind that he wanted to write a novel. And there was this desire for a long time, and takes a sabbatical year from his professional commitments, pretends he goes away, makes all his friends believe that he's in a geographical location, pretends he's in another country so nobody will bother him. He locks himself up in a room to write and cannot write, and spends a very painful year trying to write, standing in front of the blank screen, unable to overcome something, I don't know if at the level of inhibition, repression. That's for us to think together, and maybe you could help us with this, Renata. He starts drinking, maybe try to help overcome this difficulty, this writer's block, and eventually remembers something, that when he was an adolescent, around age 13, he fell in love with a woman, had a passionate love affair that implied that they were sexually active. The family found out about this relationship, separated them, and a few weeks later, this woman died tragically. She happened to be deaf and died run over by a truck. And it's not clear whether or not she was distraught because they were separated, or she maybe didn't hear the truck coming. But all this story was the first love affair in the life of this man. All, and this very traumatic situation was completely disappearing from his knowledge. He ignored it completely, or he scotomized it, or I'm not sure we can say he repressed it, because there are no clear returns of the repressed. And maybe with, perhaps you mentioned at the end of the book, the death drive, and your take is, even though you're also writing about the coronavirus in that section where death is in there, we cannot feel death more present than during a pandemic, or being reminded of the existence of the death drive. But I was wondering, how do you factor in the idea of the death drive in connection with this drive for ignorance? We don't know, most of the cases, we don't want to know anything about it. And even when we want to know, and this I was reminded of that in the examples given by Jamieson, when children try to answer the impossible questions, they come up with theories that are as absurd as those that adults may come up with. So that we have a children early budding theories, and at the same time, professional ignorance. So with that, with the idea of being professional ignorance, I'll stop.
Thank you all for wonderful comments and really very, very useful, important additions from psychoanalytic front. When you were talking, Patricia, I was questioning what happened with your guy after he remembered this traumatic story. Was he able to write?
Of course, he produced a fantastic novel.
Okay, okay, good for him, because the real problem would be on top of that he wouldn't be able to write. But
no, he produced this amazing book.
Is the book about this love story?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so it was like almost like a psychotherapy that was happening through writing, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yes, when you were talking, I was, and I agree with you about the difference between the two categories, truth and knowledge, especially in the psychoanalytic context. I was thinking about we have knowledge economy, and I'm speaking in one of the chapters, how many theorists of this knowledge economy are pointing out that knowledge economy should be actually renamed into ignorance economy. Since when we are living in the knowledge economy, actually we are forgetting how difficult it is to come to information, knowledge, when we, have all kinds of limitations like trademarks, where, even scientists cannot easily access scientific writing since it is behind paywall and so on. And then I was thinking that actually no one has renamed it into truth economy. So I agree with you that we are on a totally different kind of a horizon when we are speaking in psychoanalysis about truth, and when we are talking in a more general social context about knowledge. And ignorance in the social context does have to do with the question of knowledge, socially constructed, socially agreed knowledge in a particular time, while in the psychoanalytic term, as you rightly pointed out, the problem is the subject's, his or her relationship to truth. Yeah, all of you gave so many fantastic questions and like I would say additions to this. I loved Jameson's idea about sort of like the object petite ignorance, object petite I. And yes, if ignorance is something, it is about sort of like object small a, how we deal with what is at the core of ourself, our subjectivity, which is why I tried to, in a way, bring into the contemporary discussions, psychoanalytic discussions, the questions of genes or neuroscience, or as James said, all these questions in some way. What is the sperm? Yes, that's like what I'm also questioning when in one of the chapters I'm speaking about all the legal questions over the right sperm, or the questions which are brought with this crazy legal category that someone can be wrongly born. So what is to be rightly born would be, I think, the most problematic thing. And of course, for psychoanalysts, the really important questions will be how will people who are part of these legal battles, people, for example, children who have been born from presumably wrong sperm, where there was a mistake on the side of the sperm bank, or when they learned that the super donor was not a super donor, but a convicted criminal, or a psychopath or something. How will people, children, subjectivize this knowledge? So I think this is like what is quite often truly ignored when this kind of legal battles are going on. And they are going on not only in the United States, they're sort of coming to other countries too, although it is mostly the jurisdiction in many American states which allows this kind of category of wrongful birth to sort of even kind of exist. And as a result of it, many legal battles against sperm banks are actually fought in the United States. Yes, I also agree with everything that Marcus said. Thank you so much for pointing out the importance of the drive. And yes, I absolutely agree with the list that you were giving us from, how we can, kind of read ignorance in a variety of ways in Freud's writing. And yes, thanks for the information about his theory of dreams. And yeah, I have in a way no further comments to all your fantastic comments. So I assume we have now time for questions. Ivan will be the master of that.
I will be the master, yes. So if you can use the hand raise function, I think depending on where you are, it should be next to the participants tab, and you'll see where it says raise hand, and I will look for the hand raised and call on people. Oh, I see Elena, do you want to unmute and speak?
Yes, hi. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that's definitely a lot to think about. In hearing everything, I was thinking about Dr. Quincy Fortier, the Las Vegas infertility doctor who inseminated women seeking fertility assistance and help. And he impregnated the women with his sperm instead of that of the husbands that they were bringing to him. And that in Renata's last point, in connection to ignorance, not knowing where the sperm comes from, not knowing the father. And then also in thinking of fake news, and Macedonia being one of the epicenters of the fake news, and their name change, I think there's a lot, it's very salient that people are worried of being ignored. There's a whole name change going on in this country. Ignorance is definitely of question, and why not? Why not stir up all this fake news? So I think that really, whether it's sperm of the father, mother country, I think it definitely brings a lot in Thai. So thank you.
Thanks for your question. Yes, I don't know the particular case of Las Vegas doctor, but there have been so many doctors like this all around the world. And just, like a year ago, I watched a very interesting French documentary on this, which was following a group of people who have all been conceived through sperm bank, so they are now in their 30s, so they were like the first people conceived through in vitro insemination, and they formed a group searching for their fathers. So in this group, some succeeded. So through genetic research, especially through various genealogy sites, some of them found their fathers. Now, of course, there were many shocks when these people presented themselves to the fathers. But the interesting thing was that in this film too, they found doctors who inseminated with their sperm, and the theory was that with some, of course, there was a certain kind of a idea of grandiosity. I'm like the best, but with some, actually, it was even like a certain fantasy of being a humanitarian when they like noticed that the father's sperm, was not working. They just thought like, let's just do it in another way without, even thinking that in the future, the truth might come out. However, the most happily for the doctor, this doctor was not alive anymore, but the movie presented a story similar to what you were saying. However, the most interesting part of this search for the fathers was that some people in the group started falling in love with each other. And the biggest anxiety was related to the truth, to the question of whether they are maybe related to them. So that was like the anxiety behind the love, where, the question really became whether, in this case, love should be blind. I speak in one chapter about the importance in love to have an element of blindness, so that, at least at the first, the romantic feelings might keep going, that the fantasy might be alive. However, with the people who are potentially related, the question, of course, became, of different kind to find the truth, since, if they start building their own family, there might be a lot of, future genetical problems, that they would come across. In regards to the Northern Macedonia, it's one of the countries that I like a lot. I have visited it many times. I think I would not link that passion for fake news there with the name change. I think that the group of teenagers, very skilled teenagers in Veles, in the city where a lot of the producers of fake news were, I think, just profiteering very well from the manipulation that internet allows, and they really gained a lot of money. So I think that they were quite skilled, and it is, of course, possible that they were nudged by some political groups in the United States or elsewhere, depending for whom they were working. The name change was more the kind of the unfortunate result of the tension with Greece and the desire to join the European Union, and without the name change, they would not have any chance to get the support of Greece. Unfortunately, now they lost the support of Bulgaria, so name change didn't really help them in their sort of political struggles.
Yes, absolutely. It's an interesting country, one that I was born in, and so that's why I make the link of perhaps that fear of ignorance, right? But it makes sense what you're saying. But yeah, the fear of ignorance, because now they're losing Bulgaria's support. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Charles, and then after that, we'll go to Vanessa, please. So Charles.
Hey, thank you, Renata, so much for a really excellent and I guess ironically thought-provoking or appropriately thought-provoking presentation. And thank you to the rest of the panel for making me feel very ignorant by comparison. So my question is about power, which is something that, may have been lurking in the background during your talk, but never kind of came to the fore. So I'd like to draw it out. And so maybe one way to get at this is to say, while Marcus was speaking, he sort of reminded us that the subject is constituted through certain ignorances, and it's like unthinkable without them. And so you could say, well, is society constituted in the same way? Like you're pointing to these myriad ignorances. Are they necessary to like the concept of the existence of a society such as ours or such as the world society, however you want to look at it? And then you could find, folks who may argue with you, like maybe Hegel would say no, right? Like absolute self-knowledge is like the highest form of the society, at least for the philosophers or for the state. Maybe Plato would be on that team. But the reason this seems like it's related to, the basic political question, what is to be done, is, okay, well, if society can only be thought as incorporating these ignorances, is it possible or desirable to get rid of them? Or should we just be like enjoying them? And if it is possible and desirable to get rid of these or to change them in the other permutations of ignorance, right? Like maybe we could have more healthy ignorances. What sort of steps, what sort of ideas, maybe what roles for certain institutions, psychology, the university, schools, the secrecy of the police, do you see in ameliorating or, negating or overcoming, I guess is the word, these ignorances, or should we just kind of play our instruments as the Titanic sinks?
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, sociologists who are working in the ignorance studies, which actually is becoming a field, are speaking about structural ignorance, which means that the power structures rely on keeping people in the dark, or limiting access to information, to knowledge, or manipulating information, even with Donald Trump. We have seen that at first when he ignored the virus, it was in a way structural. As later came out, he knew very well that this is like a serious pandemic. There have been other countries which have used ignorance strategically in the time of the pandemic. One example is, for example, Turkey, or Brazil, Mexico. But in Turkey, it was interesting that Erdogan, denied coronavirus for really so long, of course, for economic, political purposes. But, the media, which are linked to the power structures there, have propagated the theory that Turks are genetically immune from coronavirus. And when I was studying, this kind of theories, I came also across similar theories in Jordania, where their geneticists, actually some official organization of genetic engineers, claimed that their lungs are so genetically made that the virus would not affect them in any serious way. So here we see a certain kind of nationalism, the perception of particular strength linked to the genes, the secret in not only in the individual but in the society as such. Of course, the Freudian kind of the Foucauldian studies of power knowledge are more and more kind of turning into power and ignorance studies, and I think it's necessary to go further with it. But in the book, I'm posing another question. Isn't with the individualization that is happening in this kind of a neoliberal type of subjectivity that prevails today, isn't there like a change that it is hard to actually sort of not have knowledge, or isn't there a certain kind of an interpellation at work today where everyone is supposed to find information, knowledge, because it exists online, or because there are search engines? So I'm calling that a certain kind of an IKEAization of society. As in with IKEA, we are supposed to, everyone of us know how to assemble furniture, you know, in regard to all other issues from health, you know, to, you know, whatever is happening around us, it is up to us. You know, you can find it, and it is up to you to find the sources behind. And here I think this is like a new form of ignorance, I would say, because the subject cannot admit actually. So it's a structural ignorance, another kind of structure. We cannot admit easily not to know, because presumably it exists somewhere, and everyone can, you know, kind of come to it. Of course, if we take into account all the secret algorithms which are behind the collection of information that we are doing, you know, these new forms of ignorance which are truly really embedded in society now, become even more complicated to understand and to address.
Okay, Vanessa, and then Alyssa Martyr after Vanessa.
Yes, I was thinking about it in terms of, in some ways, what you're saying is a question about sanctioning ignorance. But then when I was thinking about that, I was thinking, but sanction goes both ways, right? So you bless and also you punish when you sanction something. And it occurred to me that in this way, ignorance is presented as a kind of mystery, like, and then, which then sort of harkens back to the old debate between Augustine and Aquinas, you know, where on the one hand, for Aquinas, God's supposed to solve the mystery for us. And for Augustine, God is the mystery. And so it occurs to me that in this, there's this kind of ongoing sense of the mystery of knowing, or what we don't know. And even when you're saying, well, people post online things that they don't believe, but they're always signaling others do believe. That there is this sort of sense of, on the one hand, yes, we're supposed to know, but we're never supposed to know that which the other knows. That remains in the realm of punished ignorance, sanctioned ignorance. Our own ignorance, then it suggested, is more forgivable in some sense. So we end up having this, but then underlying it, what keeps coming back to me is this question of, well, is there some purview of the mystery that we have to preserve? Whether it's a fundamental kind of mystery, if it's an individual mystery or a mystery of the social, but that seems to be the basis for it, in a sense.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. With people who are posting online things that they don't believe, I don't think that they necessarily believe that others believe. I think that that there is a shared, I think, bond which does not need even that fiction that others believe. That's why I think that I would read them more as a community forming around, maybe you can say, a mystery or something that, you know, but which per se does not necessarily have a meaning, and it is like a bond in, you know, which is more important than what is at the core of sort of like the beliefs that are transmitted. So, which is why I think that the emotional impact that they get when they are sharing these beliefs or fake theories is important, but also the bond, the community that they are building themselves. So in times where, you know, many people feel ignored, here definitely they get a particular kind of a recognition in the new communities which are built around this, being incels or conspiracy theories or whatever. So I would perceive that as an important element to look at, which is why, you know, people who are studying how to oppose fake news, you know, are pointing out not by presenting what is truth, but by addressing, sort of like the emotional gains behind, and hopefully instilling some doubt on the side of the subject, but not, through lecturing or through simply negating this kind of shared beliefs.
Which I think goes back again to this question of these are congregations of faith that are being built.
Yeah, but they
Well,
are communities.
There's a lack of something that's being served by building these congregations.
Yeah, but they are the churches of today, which are very strong ones.
Alyssa, do you still have a question?
Yeah, I do. I have a response and kind of a question. First of all, great discussion. Thank you all so much. I learned so much, and it was fascinating. I guess I wanted to talk about helplessness, and I wanted to talk, my first part of my question would be to Jameson, but it's really to all of you, which is, it feels to me, Jameson, in the list of things that you were talking about, because I love this object petite I, ignorance, but some of the ones that you brought up are totally classic forms. So what is a vagina, or what shit, or, what Patricia then referred to as the sexual theories of children. And, that children come up, I think it was Patricia, but children will come up with answers for sexual difference, which doesn't exist for them, or they'll come up with answers for where do babies come from. And those answers are absurd, but they are both the answer and the question. So they're a way of having a wish fulfillment that is maintaining and not maintaining ignorance. And I guess what I heard you say, Jameson, in the list of things that you talked about, one of the ones that was the most interesting was the problem of clicking on a link when we consent to something and we have no fucking clue what we're consenting to. And I sort of want to say as a provocation, because I've entertained this thought recently, that, I know it may sound sort of reductive and dumb, but that the actual unthinkability of climate change, the unthinkability of the fact that there's something that the world is radically ending in a way that there's no sovereign figure that can control it. At this point, no individual, however much you recycle, and the sovereign states are not getting together in a social bond in order to solve this problem. And, I think the temporality of how fast we're going to hell is much faster. So the sheer fact of having a truth that we cannot know, you want to take death or the death drive, that something has happened to that symbolization, which I would want to say ground zero of it is climate change, because there's something about which we're all profoundly helpless. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe all the scientists and the sovereigns will get together and, they'll do something fantastic. But from where I sit, sort of all ways of imagining symbolism of futurity are really kind of compromised by that thing in relation to which we're helpless. And a lot of the things that we're talking about, let's say the virus or virality as such, or take the internet. And, I recently been thinking about this, and I came up with a bunch of little formulas, like there's no negation, as in a dream in the internet. And that's something that, everybody's been saying here. But that if we look at the forms of denial, and Renata, I heard what you were saying, to me, a lot of them take the form of dream work. They're all like a structure of primary processes. And so I guess what I'm getting at is, what is the relationship between sort of very primal helplessness and wish fulfillment, because there actually is something that is unbearable. And historically, it's been the function of a social bond in order to come up with symbolic ways of binding that whatever unthinkabilities there are, we produce religion, we produce politics, we produce social structures. But we've now both sort of in the ecosystem that humans have produced for our own unlivable future, we have produced a situation where individual subjects are relatively helpless in relation to big data, in relation to algorithms, in relation to that button that you push, and in relation to climate change. And so what we're seeing is this sort of explosion of fascist sovereignty or different kinds of assertions of sovereignty everywhere where sovereignty shouldn't be. So we have, if we go to Freud, I'm thinking of the Freud of His Majesty the Baby. And I guess I would read, Renata, that sense that when people are sharing things that they don't believe, it's not a question of believing or not believing. I mean, the aggressivity is sometimes there, but sometimes it's a pleasure that's more primary process. It's more a wish fulfillment. It's more a sharing. And there's something like I've been thinking about the even in the aggressivity of the Trump rallies of lock her up, lock her up. There's kind of a weird dreamlike carnivalesque spirit where nobody knows, I mean, especially when it's the Republicans, nobody actually believes that they believe, but the pleasure there, and that pleasure it is aggressive, but it's also dreamlike. And it's childlike. And so I guess I'm sort of thinking about these dream figurations as being a response to helplessness. And that helplessness is certainly, I mean, we can politicize this, we can call it neoliberal, but it's producing fantasies of magical thinking, of sovereignty. And I think those formulations are different when we're dealing with, like, getting to the question about power. We're not dealing with power in an older model. I mean, I guess you can take a Foucauldian way and think biopower or virality, but the internet or genes and Renata, in your example of like Erdogan, you know, that Turks like are immune to the virus. I mean, the thing that struck me is the fantasy of immunity. So it's the fantasy of invulnerability. And that piece, that fantasy of immunity is in direct proportion to the massive helplessness. And so I guess what I want to say is that there is a mode to this ignorance. And here's sort of a question I'm putting both to Jameson and to Marcus. To Marcus, I would say that there's a kind of re-childishization or a kind of mode of collective regression, which means that what you, Marcus, are proposing is a very mature, the becoming ignorant that you want really takes a lot of labor and a lot of ability to tolerate. So I would be all for it. But I guess what I'm seeing is a fabric for a social structure that is producing a kind of dramatic regressions all over the place, experience of helplessness because there's something we can't know, an actual truth that's unbearable, like we're all going to hell, and you know our social structures can't stop the acceleration of the end of the world that's coming because of climate change. I mean, maybe I'm being melodramatic here, but there's something about a futurity that just is shifted, and that those then produce forms of sovereign fantasies of sovereignty in all the wrong places. So that's sort of my thoughts about that.
Okay, anyone want to respond? Jameson, Marcus, Renata?
I can start, and then Marcus, do you want to?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Alyssa. I mean, Marcus and I were throwing around the idea of what it would mean to create, because you know, one of the strongest points of Renata's book is about the social bonds, you know, to try to displace it from a question of why do they think these crazy things, or what happened to knowledge, but to say that something's going on the level of the connections that are formed around these pockets of willful ignorance, let's say. And then all of the phenomena that push us towards knowledge, and being responsible for our knowledge and being experts, and the IKEAization of life, as she puts it, do it yourself, basically. And I mean, I think that even what she's saying with IKEA, do it yourself, would be the response to the climate problem. It's your problem. It's not our problem together. But I was also thinking of the Freudian child, because Freud says that when the parents reveal that they lied or don't know what the child wants them to know, he says that it's a betrayal and an alienation, and then a source of isolation. And maybe this kind of regressive atmosphere that you're talking about is that it is betrayal, alienation, isolation, but without remedy. Right? Without something then coming in to help it be simply what we don't know and the kinds of things that we need to do about what we don't know. I mean, so we're all, I think of these communities as swimming in those responses to the truth of helplessness and non-knowledge. But yeah, so that was Marcus.
Yeah, thank you. Also, from my side, one of the notions, but that would be cynical now, but I bring it up nevertheless, and that I wanted to refer to as a possible alternative to the passion for ignorance, as a how to say, as a description, also as a concept or as a way of thinking, is a term that comes from Bataille, and it's voluptuous powerlessness, a term that he uses in the 1953 conference on non-knowledge, which is his alternative to the frenzy of knowledge and ignorance in the simple sense. And he develops his existentialist ethics of non-knowledge there, and it has a lot to do with helplessness and powerlessness. But there it seems to be, and this is why I think it's now cynical after what you reminded us of, a very individualist to a certain extent project, although it leads into all kinds of proliferations that are much more generous than that. But so I think that is true, that but that's the move Renata made, no? I mean, with you cannot think of ignoring as a sovereign act. Ignoring is entangled in being ignored, and that you could even go further, moving into that there is a passion for being ignorant, and that leads certainly to the primary process and to something very regressive. And I would say for psychoanalysis at this place, the dichotomy of knowledge and truth is no longer sufficient. I think for very precise reasons that have to do with something that's very old on the one hand, but has come up now with coronavirus for all of us, that the major figure of knowledge today, and in the medical field, it's absolutely dominant, is statistics. And everybody will tell you that statistics is not knowledge. Of course, it's probability. So there's an impossibility of the subject of relating to what actually makes knowledge in the field of medicine, which is the most important one, impossible to inscribe herself or himself into this, because there is no speech act that allow you to bridge the gap between 10% will die and am I going to be one of the 10%? It's not of the order of truth to be a subject in this place, and the lacking connection between statistics and one's own subjectivity. So, and I think what comes in this place is acting out, and passage à l'acte. I think, and this happens in the click, and it happens in the sharing of stupidity. And I think that psychoanalysis should work with knowledge in the complicated way of knowledge that ignores itself, truth in the complicated way of truth that is only half spoken, and the act, which becomes even more fundamental because it's the only way of situating oneself in the pandemic. You have to act. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Stay at home, don't stay at home. Be one of the ignorant ones or be none of the ignorant ones. All these are not, they're not acts of knowledge, nor are they acts of truth speaking, they're acts of acts. So in that sense, it's the dimension of the act, and in that sense, immediate satisfaction, the primary process become fundamental. So I think that's it's an important and very difficult field, because that's what you want to avoid, the acting out in psychoanalysis. But all of a sudden you called into acknowledging that act and acting becomes somehow an important medium in the psychoanalytic work, which comfortably till now you try to keep out and work with the paradigm of knowledge and truth speaking, which is not sufficient anymore. So I would add that to the dire picture you drew with the climate change.
You can also start again collecting toilet paper, which probably is still happening. I don't know. It was the most interesting, I think, psychoanalytic moment in the first wave in the United States. It reminded me in the late 80s, when Yugoslavia had, like really high inflation, and then, early 90s when Yugoslavia collapsed, toilet paper was, wow, yeah, you had to buy toilet paper and coffee. Now, of course, there have been theories how this buying toilet paper, in a Freudian theory, if you look at Freudian theory, was like a kind of a regression or a desire to at least control something, the anal phase and so on. There have been some interesting writings about it, but I really liked an Australian example because they were collecting toilet paper too. One coffee shop, introduced toilet paper instead of money. So if you wanted to get a coffee, you had to give 3 rolls of toilet paper. And for a kilo of coffee beans, you had to give 36 rolls of toilet paper, which I don't know how they came to these numbers, but I think that they sort of like realized a kind of a Freudian fantasy that, excreta has a value of gold. It's a gift.
This would support Alyssa's theory that what we're all scotomizing at every point is the climate catastrophe, the shit, the fact that we made the earth shit. So, yeah.
Okay. Just one, I guess we're going to go just maybe 10 more minutes. I have a kind of question. I was thinking very much in the mode of what Alyssa was saying. I wonder why it seems up till now, the assumption has been that if things get bad enough, people will have to face the reality. It's as if the number of deaths will rise enough, and of course that is, psychoanalytically, there's no reason to expect that people are going to be shocked into finally coming to grips with reality because it gets worse. It's, as Alyssa was saying, we seem to see a kind of regressive effect. I wanted to ask also about there's some aspect of this kind of complaint that it's not fair going on all political sides. And, one thing I find confusing is that in a way, the truth of what's happening politically is that there's this masquerade that there is a concern with democracy, but really within this regressive primary process, the truth is really a truth of power. And in fact, Trump has always very nakedly only stood for that the truth of life is the truth of power. And we get this very confusing mix-up where people are complaining on the level of fairness. At the same time, the real of it seems to be that within a regressive, everything going to shit reality, the truth is the truth of power. And in the beginning of the Trump years, all the analysts seemed to think that if we just made the case that Trump was a malignant narcissist, people would be really would awaken and do something about it based on this expert knowledge of analysts. But of course, that hasn't been the case at all.
Yeah, but the similar thing was with Melania, who comes from Slovenia. Here we are joined at the hip. There was this fantasy that she will rebel, or now is the fantasy that maybe she divorces him and then tell the truth, whatever the truth might be. But there is nothing behind the mask. So as Lacan knows very well.
Just maybe
Okay.
to add a twist. I don't know if do we have time or not? Are we doing?
Go ahead, Patricia. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was reminded, maybe I'm having working a lot on Afro-pessimism, so I had an optimistic thought, or maybe pessimistic in disguise. And I was reminded that when Freud talks about helplessness very early on in the project, that in the project, in that text, he identifies at the origin of life the helplessness of the newborn that is completely dependent upon the caretaker, and that's the beginning of a moral feeling. So what happened? Are we ignoring them? What happened with that moment of potential ethical subjectivity? Where are we with that? I don't know, to everyone in the panel.
No caretaker.
There is no big other. Doesn't exist. So it's the fall of the big other. So then we need to be ignorant. It's too terrible.
Mother Earth is not holding us.
When Elisa was, speaking about climate change, I was reminded of a sociologist, I think Norgard is her name, Mari Norgard, who has studied this question of, why people ignore climate change. When she looked at Norwegians, so she analyzed people who had a self-perception in many cities in Norway that they are, lovers of nature. They were outdoorsy, they were, recycling and so on. So she questioned, how come that, people who are, constantly recycling and, are climbing the mountains and so on, do so little to push their government, to kind of invest in other sources than fossil fuels. And of course, this was it's a little bit older study now in the last years. Norway, especially their financial, groups are trying to invest in other in renewables and so on. But her idea was that that there was an anxiety for people of thinking about the future, where the idea of prosperity that they embraced would not exist. And so there was a certain kind of a denial that their prosperity relies on sort of fossil fuels and this kind of energies, which she said that they had like an incompatible idea in their head. They're trying to preserve themselves by in actually kind of closing their eyes. They're trying to preserve their sort of like well-being, but it does not contradict with their self-perception that they are ecologically minded people. So I think that in many countries, developed countries, you have similar problem, that the idea of prosperity, which we have embraced for so long, are something, these ideas are something that we don't want to give up. And actually our sort of type of economy, which sort of is fueled by these ideas.
I just noticed Andrew Marcus had a question in the chat, if he's still there, and that would be the last one.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I just have been thinking that the real seems to be wanting to just creep in everywhere where it's not welcome, right? And I think there might be a wish in the passion for ignorance that has to do with something actually positive, perhaps, and I want to ask the panelists and Renata about that. And that is a wish to get away, as knowledge, as has been said, you know, the knowledge economy is so exclusive, you know, in relationship to class and other means of exploitation and oppression and exclusion. I think the passion for ignorance on some level may have something to do with a desire for simplicity and a desire for nature, a desire for a kind of non-mediation, a rejection of language on a certain level. And again, just to clarify, getting back to simplicity, meaning a sort of liberation from the tyranny of knowledge, from the tyranny of the kind of systems that one can't possibly master and know, but a desire perhaps to get back to living in the world, you know, from a phenomenological perspective, to be able to meet experience, be able to meet what comes at you, to get your food and your shelter, and to live simply. And I wonder if any of the panelists or Renata, you might have something to say about that.
Now, I would just say that in this case, then the pandemic was a wish fulfillment because it brought us simplicity.
I mean, potentially as a, you know, as a kind of silver lining, it might bring a certain kind of simplicity, you know, a kind of awareness of death, obviously, and then a questioning of values. But I wonder if there is something about, yeah, possibilities, or, you know, the desire to come out from under systematization, in a sense.
But it would be it would almost be to push the individualization to its most extreme point, where it, you know, yes, like you have been affected by the, you know, I keep thinking of the phrase, the rage of the belly-turned mind, both in its governmental, prosperous, and knowledge economy systems. But then your solution is to just be simple. And in that, if you're privileged enough to do that, you ignore everyone else who's you know, falling by the wayside. But I think that you're right, that there's an incredible desire for it. You hear it in patients all the time.
But isn't it also possibly not about the individual? I mean, it seems to be that's what's ascendant, unfortunately. But isn't it also possible that there would instead be a movement toward collective solution and social equalization? You know, wouldn't that be also a possible outcome?
I hope so.
Me too. And I think at the start of the pandemic, that's what we were talking a lot, that it will be, you know, a moment of rethinking the society of the future, rethinking the questions of, you know, equality, especially climate change. And since, you know, we actually knew that a pandemic might be coming, there were so many books, and even, you know, governments were preparing in some countries, but all this was ignored. You know, we learned that these things existed only when the pandemic happened, and now we know that future pandemics might come. So exactly, if we are hopeful, that's, I think, the way to go, that the future might be less individualistic, more thinking about, you know, communal choices. But, you know, here the battle with the capital will be probably, you know, long and hard. And at the moment, things are not looking too optimistic. In my home country, Slovenia, we are, acting, as Marcus rightly said. We are now having we had bicycling revolutions because we could not protest on the streets, so we were biking around. Now people are driving around by cars, but unfortunately it looks that in many countries pandemic is being used to suppress people, and especially to suppress political actions. And that's what is my anxiety, that the power actually will use the pandemic for strengthening non-democratic forces. Hopefully America is going in a better direction.
Okay, well, we've gone somewhat over, so I think we should probably stop. Thank you so much, Renata. And
thank you
just to remind,
all. Thanks for everyone for joining me, and all the comments from my dear friends, the panelists, and thanks even for moderating.
And once again, the code to order the book was pasted in the chat for 30% off of that, and on the website as well. So I wish everyone a good end to your weekend, and thank you again.
Thank you, Renata.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.